Hello and welcome to the Omnex webinar ISO 17025 2017, Key Changes and Challenges. The presenters today are Chad Kymal, Omnex CTO, and Dave Barber, Omnex Senior Consultant, ISO 17025 Champion. Chad Kymal is the CTO and founder of Omnex, which is an international consulting and training organization headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Over the course of Chad's successful career, he has served on the Malcolm Baldrige Board of Examiners and has received numerous quality achievement awards, including the Quality Professional of the Year Award from the American Society for Quality Automotive Division. Chad is also the president of Omnex System, a software provider for ISO 9001, 14001, and 27001, as well as risk tools such as FEMA and control plans. Chad is the author of 7 books and more than 100 papers, including multiple on integrated management systems. Chad will be introducing the second presenter today, which is Dave Barber. Chad, you can take it away.
Miles, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. So I get the privilege here of introducing one of Omnex's very senior consultant, trainer and program manager. Dave has got a vast experience in multiple different fields. As you know, Omnex has a chance to work in a number of different industries, and Dave has been one of our key consultants working in many of these industries. So not only does Dave have a background in ISO 9001 or IATF 16949, AS 9100, 14001, or OSHA's 18001 or ISO 45001. He is also Omnex's champion and lead on ISO IEC 17025. So just a couple of things about Dave. He's a 26-year senior member of ASQ, and Dave, interestingly, has an electronics background, and he does many interesting implementations. Dave Barber has done a number of 17025 implementations. Dave, do you want to share a little bit about your background on 17025?
Sure, thanks, Chad. You can hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Great. Yeah, just to give you a little bit of background, I studied the very first microprocessor in electronics many years ago, 35 years ago now. My background originally started a lot in calibration. I made high precision portable calibration equipment and started in my lab career that way, flow meters, transducers, all kinds of portable type calibration, very high precision electrical as well. And then from there, I moved into telecommunications, into EMC labs, laboratory accreditations for emissions and suppressions for laboratories. From there, I moved into automotive. I worked for Magna International. I worked in heavy, high safety products, and still to this day, there's 3 or 4 labs that I help work with in Magna International as far as safety, closures, steering, and exteriors. And then from there, I went into medical devices and did FDA submissions. I've worked with labs for FDA. Since that time, I've worked with Omnex, doing consulting on and off now for the better part of 18 years. At that time, over the years, I've done thermal accreditations. I've also done dimensional. I've also worked with the U.S. military as far as water quality and Zika virus and virus testing. Also in Saudi Arabia, water quality, solar panels, and then plastics and many other electronic suppression emissions, California, all through that area. So that's a little bit about myself as far as 17025 goes. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Folks, let's get right into the topic of the day. So what we're going to be doing today, of course, is we're going to be spending the next hour on ISO 17025, what's new, what are the challenges. And so let me get started. This is the agenda that we're planning. Major changes to ISO IEC 17025 2017. I will start things off, then turn it over to Dave Barber, who will then continue on. Then what we'll do is we'll cover the conceptual improvements to ISO 17025, its relationship to ISO 9001, hence comes in this tie to process approach and risk-based thinking. Then what we'll do is we'll do a sample of detailed changes and then finish with implementation steps for ISO 17025. Dave, as we present this, feel free to chime in, and as will I when you're presenting. So with that, let's talk about the major changes to ISO IEC 17025 2017 as the first topic as we introduce this new standard or updated standard. So according to ISO IEC 17025, it's being run by the working group 44. Here is why they made the changes. Number one, as you all know, folks, many things have changed in the market and technology for labs, so the standards have to keep up. Number two, they wanted to cover more activities. You'll see the change in the scope when we talk about this bullet. Think about the sampling now that's included in terms of the activities, encompass the activities and new ways of working in labs today. And there's 100,000 users. So as Dave mentioned to you, anything from water purity that Dave and Omnex has been involved in, or a couple of FDA labs we have helped, and Mary Jo from Omnex has worked in a couple of FDA with more biological, and medical items. So what else has changed? To cover technical changes, vocabulary and developments in IT techniques. So it's something interesting for me to know how many of the labs today are looking at, things like enterprise-wide software. And some of the labs I know are, encompassed in companies that have a QMS in. How does this all tie into one integrated management system? And of course, when ISO 9001 changes, you definitely want to change accompanying standards. So let's quickly look and see why else 17025 changed. Well, because ISO 9001 changed, as they said, adapting to a changing world, enhancing an organization's ability to satisfy customers, provide a consistent foundation to the future. And we are in very complex environments today, so standards have to change to accommodate that. Ensure that the new standard reflects the need not just of customers, but just of interested parties. And very important to ISO is this idea of integrating with other management systems. All right. So keeping in with this idea, here is sort of the evolution that we have seen. First we have an ISO 9001 1994 affecting 17025 1999. And of course before that it was Guide 25. We use similar languages between the two standards. And then starting at the 2005 revision, we saw beginning to use common requirements. We actually saw corrective action. We saw a lot of terminology that's in ISO 9001 reflected in 17025. And that takes a full turn to today, where there's many common requirements in ISO 17025 and ISO 9001. In fact, they will share with you that they offer an option to implement Clause 8.0 by implementing ISO 9001. Let's move on. So what are the major changes? One major change is this idea of sampling. So, not that you could not have included sampling in your lab management system. By the way, I did want to sort of mention to you, when we looked at all these standards, that what we're offering today is actually the IRCA certification with the lead auditor as a way for somebody who wants to become a lead auditor, but also, of course, there's internal auditor, and there's also understanding. I wanted to just sort of mention that when I talked about the evolution of ISO IEC 17025, that this is also something that Dave Barber is doing for Omnex. All right. So, Dave, I did want you to sort of we talked a little bit about the implication of the scope change with sampling. And, maybe you can talk about companies or labs that only do sampling or as the front end of a lab. And second, how it affects maybe inside a manufacturing plant. Dave?
Sure. Yeah, well, there's like blood labs that do sampling, and then eventually, you'll take it at the doctor's office, and it'll eventually go to the lab. The lab wants to ensure that does the testing that the sampling methods were done in accordance to their requirements, so they wouldn't compromise any of the, if you want to call it, field sampling. That would also apply to earth sampling, water sampling. So you have the choice of either doing some of these techniques separately, but ultimately it's tied to a test facility. So some companies just do forensics or testing, but the sampling's always part of the system. So they've expanded it so that in other areas you'll look at ways that, for example, in the reporting part of the standard, you have to specify how the sampling was done, and that those controls and those activities of the lab aren't going to compromise or cross-contaminate any of the sample or the ultimate result of the test. Where in manufacturing, sometimes we'll give a little bit more detail on, if, for example, you're sampling a part of a car or a part of electronics, and where you might take temperature or heat. We want to have more descriptive methodologies that the areas of sampling in the physical larger piece was done consistently, and we take pictures and things of those applications to make sure that the variability of the sampling does not compromise the end result of the test, and or calibration as well, depending on how we might trace a part or do something of that nature. So that's why it's been expanded. Okay.
So, folks, the bottom line is, if sampling did not need to be included in the older standards, but now if there is sampling, well, of course there's always sampling. So sampling has to be included. And those of you listening in from manufacturing, keep in mind the samples typically are collected by QA people or the operators, and then picked up and taken to the lab. That whole process of sampling, making sure you have good samples, there's no identification and traceability mixed up, all that remains very important now with the new change in scope. Next, one of the big changes is the idea of the process approach. And the process approach now matches that of the standards that use the high-level structure, not just ISO 9001. As you know, the high-level structure is in EMS, Environmental Management Systems, and ISO 45001, Health and Safety. In fact, I believe I had a quote here. Well, maybe I didn't. There's a good quote out there that talks about how when you get 17025, you actually get ISO 9001 2015. I think CASO said that. And of course, the third big change was very important, not just in labs, just in organizations, but the lab management system has embraced it strongly, is the focus on information technologies and the use of computer systems, electronic records, and the electronic results and reports. Okay, so you will see running through the standard this idea of information technologies. And lastly, a new section on risk-based thinking. And both of those, Dave will talk to you a little bit more about. Now what we'll do, we'll take a pause and give you a chance to write down some questions. While we do this, Miles, we will transfer the presentation from me to Dave Barber, who will be the main presenter for the rest of the presentation. Folks, write down your questions. As you all know, there is an interface in your GoToMeeting where you can click the questions and you can write in your questions. And we'll try to pause and give you some time every so often so you can identify the questions. Go ahead, Dave.
Everything looks good, Miles?
Everything looks good, Dave.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm sitting here in a hotel room in the Toronto area. It's kind of gloomy, so just to get some perspective of where I am. So I'm going to take you through now some of the larger, kind of more, and some specific changes as well. I've actually been through some similar, I've done some training. I've developed courses recently in the changes, so I'm very intimate with the changes. I've gone through every little detail of the standard. I've looked at how it might impact current lab companies I've done with, or organizations, different industries, automotive, medical devices, consumer products, health, safety, all that type of thing. So I've kind of got a good perspective. So if you have questions later, I will do my best to answer them. So some of the kind of the larger, or the changes that we have, the high level changes I call them, Chad introduced and talked a bit about some of them, but the previous standard, as far as structure goes, if some of you know the standard well, you'll know that it used to have section 4. The first sections 1, 2, and 3 are in all ISO standards, the introductory sections, but the clauses that are auditable were section 4 and 5 before. Now they're from 4 to 8. They didn't take on the full structure of ISO, the new standard from 4 to 10. I will show you that in a little bit, why that is. The other thing, obviously, the process approach, as Chad indicated. We've been trying to encourage this in all management systems for a long time, rather than just procedures. We still may have procedures or instructions on how to execute certain calibration, sampling, or test activities, but as far as the broader base of performance and as far as effectiveness and efficiency goes. So sometimes in the standard, they'll use the word process or procedure, and that is considered interchangeable at this point in time, as it was in the past 20, maybe 15 years in other quality management systems. The other thing that's been changed has been just a bit more improvement on the terminology of information management rather than document control or records management, as it was done in ISO 9001. A lot of our data now is electronic, so we're not dealing with much paper anymore. Some of the other things, as Chad indicated too, the new standard, so all this is new, the whole risk management side of it that's been added to the standard in section 8.5. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. The one thing that's too is interesting, and I have it a bit later too, is the removal of preventive action. The reason that was removed, and that applies to ISO 9000 as well, was to encourage us to do risk-based thinking and preventive-based thinking right up front, and try to look back at our business processes or our testing activities, for example, to how we could prevent errors or prevent data, rather than just triggering preventive action because of a non-conformance, which most people were doing. And it wasn't very effective. So we have it more now pushed to the front end of the planning and the risk side of things. The other thing also now, if we have ISO 9000, I've dealt with companies in electronics where they've had 9000, they've had ISO 14000, they've had automotive standards, and they've also had OSHA, occupational health and safety, and they all follow similar systems. So before we used to have manuals for both and everything else. Now we can kind of integrate it all together in one business process. And if you already have ISO 9000, one in those systems, and you follow things as far as auditing or management review, information management, records management, we can use those same processes to fulfill the requirements of 17025. And if you're already certified to that, the auditor would generally only brush over that part of the standard and would look more at the technical and the applications of testing and or calibration sampling. The other thing too, the broader definition of laboratory activities, I will show you a bit about that later, but just as more, we use activities rather than just a simple test. The activities could encompass not just sampling, testing, or calibration, but it also could encompass the activities of reporting or collecting data, transferring data, agreeing on the standard that you want to test to. So it's a much broader terminology. As with ISO 9000, we call it the outcome of a process rather than just one execution. And then a bit more specific changes. So these are, I've done a bit more reference to some of the clauses. Now, these are still very general, but for example, we remove preventive action, as I indicated. Also, no longer is there a need to have a specific quality or technical manager. We assign responsibilities to certain activities within the lab. I mean, you could still have a quality or technical manager, but it is not generally specified. We do not have to have a manual that outlines that as it was in the old standard, which was very cumbersome. But we would still have job descriptions and things and technical reviews of records and reports. The other change would be also a lot in the front end of the standard in 4.1 and 4.2 to do with impartiality and confidentiality. That was heavily sprinkled through the previous standard, but it wasn't very well connected. So there's a lot of additions in, and it's very well laid out, and it was simplified in the new standard. Descriptive yet simplified, if that makes sense. A couple of the other things too that was added, we changed the terminology. We still have our lab scope that will be on maybe an accredited lab, whether it be NIST or A2LA or whatever that may be. They call it a lab scope. But they've tried to broaden the term within the management system to call it the range, which would be the range of activities that we do. The reason why is a scope dictates what tests or calibrations we can do, where the range specifies what range of maybe temperature or a range of maybe dimensional measurements we may do, or even a range of what different tests we would do, but limited to certain maybe destructive type testing or non-destructive or things of that nature. So it's a little bit more broad, the term. We're still going to use it fairly interchangeably, just as far as what we're used to, but it's called more of a range now, which makes sense as far as linearity goes if you think of testing or calibration. The other thing we've changed too, or that has been changed, is competency requirements. Instead of just having training of lab personnel or future training, which was in the previous standards, both revisions, we now deal with competency, not just testing or training, but skills, competency, and trying to determine the competency level of the people carrying out the test or calibration. And we make assessments and empower people to have the competency, or we assess their competency to make sure they're meeting the requirements. Also, something that was new that was added was more to do with the control. When you have, for some of you, one of the very first things I did it'd be almost 20 years ago now, was helping the first accredited lab in Canada to get certified for how to test on-site thermal, which would more be for furnaces, and then all the activities of furnaces. But now they want you to have tighter controls over the environmental conditions. I was just at an automotive company recently, and all the environmental chambers that comes on site to do that. And as far as keeping good working conditions, if you want to call it 5S, and tidy even within their truck on how they don't damage equipment. So they've expanded that outside of that to look at those factors, which should have been there in the first place. A couple other changes too. This is a terminology that has come from ISO 9000, that you need to look at your external providers, not just maybe if you farm out, if you will, a test or calibration activity, but it would be, who you buy, maybe who you buy software from, if you're buying data manipulators or DACs, for how you buy the certain hardware that manipulates the data. Are they helping us? And any software things of activities that might go in there. Any type of provider that way. Cleaning services could even be problematic in some type of environment, depending if you have a clean lab or a sterile lab. So those would be external providers that we would have to consider additional controls over, or additional requirements of monitoring them.
So Dave,
Sure.
Looks like the word lab scope has been replaced by the range
Correct.
of activities. Am I right? So
Correct.
This will have a ripple effect, I would imagine, on standards like IATF 16949 that uses the word lab scope presently.
It's funny you say that. I've audited, and we have audited many companies. I'm finding people aren't keeping their lab scopes up to date.
Yes,
that's one of the common things I've been seeing. And and they're not tying people to it and methods, and it's been getting very sloppy. I don't know why. Seems that they've lost
Absolutely,
focus.
Dave.
So,
Yep.
okay, thanks. A little bit more too, we've greatly improved the documentation as far as the agreement with the customer. So there's actually two little things here it talks about. So if a customer asks for us to do a certain test and we know it's not the current standard, we have to tell them, or we have to be aware that the standard's changed, just in case. So, and it specifically says in there, so you with the two of you together have to agree on the test method. You can't just assume they wanted the older one or the newer one. And you need to be aware that the new standard test methods have been changed, and you have to keep a close eye on the industry to see what test methods. If there's an ISO or ASTM standard, then you want to look at that. If it's a specific to one customer in automotive or some other industry, then we want to work with that. So we have to be more conscious of the revision level of the industry standard or test methods, mainly for test labs. It could be for calibration labs as well, but depending on whether they're following an international standard. And then another thing too, lab performance. We want to look at not just did the lab get done right. However, the one thing that was always a bit of, and being a mathematical type background, I've always struggled with why we don't do complex, or we don't consider measurement uncertainty enough when we're doing testing. It was always kind of not written very well in the previous standard. So no matter what type of test you do, you're generally giving a result. There could be a test where it's more of an attribute, where it's just pass fail, but normally there's some type of result in there, a unit of measure. We have to continue, or even further continue in the new standard, to look at the measurement uncertainty and the variability of the input variables and the response variables, or your type A, type B variability. And now it has to be considered, and uncertainty now may have to be considered in even putting in your lab results.
Hey Dave,
Sure.
Short of doing MSA, what else can they do? You know, I mean, they can definitely do ANOVA, but what else could you do in terms of coming up with measurement uncertainty? Or is this de facto saying all lab equipment? I've tussled with this myself,
Well,
especially working in the semiconductor industry.
Well, the simplest way, obviously, eventually you're sending a piece of equipment out or bringing somebody in for calibration. When you get a piece of equipment calibrated to a national standard, to a unit of measure, it will give you an uncertainty. No matter what, it is required by labs being accredited. So that uncertainty statement plus the results, if we want to call that bias or accuracy or repeatability, those two combined together, we take the certificate data and we see how is that in alignment, or that variable, that how much does that variation contribute to the end result of our test. There's no excuse for not doing that. It's always been done, and that would be your first one. Okay, and then there would be simplified other mathematical testing we can do. You have interlaboratory comparisons, and I'll have a list of them all for you in later in the presentation.
Excellent, Dave.
Okay. Okay, something else that's new too is ensuring the validity of tests. They call it the validation. What they're trying to do, they expanded this. Just because you do a test for a customer or a certain test standard you follow, is it really what the customer wants? You know, they're kind of trying to get that connection in. You know, maybe the customer says, I want to do this range of thermal testing, or this range of destructive testing, or some type of testing, or I want to sample it 6 times, but is that really the best approach? You know, so we're looking a little bit more at, will the method that I use for testing or calibration really give them what they need, the end result of the test, not just the test report, but the validation or the physical, or what they're really going to use the results for. So we want to get more in tune with our customer as to, you know, what are these results for, and what is that information being used to ultimately make a decision on. So that's something, they didn't take it too far, but they want to make sure that we understand the difference between doing a test properly and giving the customer kind of a validation of what they really need. So that's kind of a simplified version of that. And we've done a lot of expansion in the quality or the quality assurance checks for that, as Chad was just indicating. So I put a little slide on some of the additional type of internal or external checks we can do to make sure the validity of the test results are there. Additionally, also, and some changes that were made, the complaints section has been improved, non-conforming work has been greatly improved, and also the data and information management sections have been dramatically improved. They've been really well aligned with the new ISO standard. Some things have been taken out. They've improved it and simplified it, but yet made it better and more comprehensive. So a lot of time was put into those areas looking at it. Okay, so that's kind of the major changes, why we did the changes, and then kind of a little bit of detailed examples. So now what I would like to do is just kind of take you through kind of how things kind of the conceptual improvements, just as more of a little bit of a summary too. So remember that now we have sampling, and you see here, sampling is always tied to a subsequent test or calibration. We do sampling as we're doing the testing and calibration, but we also get samples that come into us, as Chad was indicating, or we were indicating that there might be other people involved in doing the sampling. So we want to clarify how that's done and understand that variation, or get consistent sampling techniques to make sure it doesn't compromise the test results or the calibration results. The other thing we want to do is promote kind of the operation of the lab and how the confidence in the lab, as I said earlier, that we have competency and confidence in how the lab carries out. And also, we also want to look at the results and how we generate those results. Kind of more of a, that data can be lost, data can be manipulated, so we got to take it that far. The other thing too is we also want to look at the standard specifically implies in the overview that we are following the new ISO 9000 principles. So many parts, even in the non-Section 8, have followed terminology from ISO 9000. It's really, really well done. And then just a little bit more as the overview too. As we said, there's risk and opportunities. I'll get to that shortly. And then also how we facilitate in cooperation between labs. The purpose always of 17025 was myself, if I'm paying for a lab service or I want a calibration service, and when I'm in industry, I want to make sure that globally we're harmonizing the techniques that we use so that the variability, or if we want to call it the uncertainty that is stated by a lab or a calibration lab, that the same methodology is used, or that the variability or uncertainty would be consistent globally. And that is one of the most important things. You're paying for this service, or we're providing that service. We want to make sure that it is done effectively. And I'm still seeing, I still look at certificates that are accredited to 17025, and even for calibration, they're not putting the uncertainty on there. They're not putting the unit of measure on properly. But I'm not sure why that is. It needs to improve. You're paying for that. When we're providing it, we should do it properly. So that's still been there. The other thing that, just as a kind of an overview, is that 17025, the new standard, there's a committee that oversees that. And the decision obviously was made to replace the previous version. And as Chad said, it really hasn't been rewritten in any great form, or hasn't even been touched for almost 12 years. So you can imagine there's been a lot of changes. Now, the interesting thing I'll show you later, the cycle is to replace in 3 years. So there's a lot of variables that do that. As of 3 years from the date of November 2017, it will be obsolete, and the new one has replaced it. So there will be no hanging on to the old one. And I'm assuming if you have ISO 9001 in your facility or some part of your facility, as of September this year, you'll have switched over to that new standard as well. So if you already haven't. So that will come in alignment. If anybody in automotive or aerospace, you would have been similar time frame, and some other industries as well. The other thing too, just as a general, I talked about the association of sampling. I keep reminding everybody of that. And then also that the lab specific requirements now are in section 4, 5, 6, and 7. I'll show you a matrix in a few minutes. And then the quality systems, as far as how to oversee the big quality planning and documenting and management reviews and continual improvement, are all now in section 8, from 8.2 to 8.9. So there's 9 sections there. Now, the reason they didn't put it at the front of the standard is because they gave you options to whether you had already been certified to ISO or registered to ISO, thus you would just do the front end of the standard. So it made more sense to put it at the back, even though from a conceptual standpoint, it may have made more sense to put it at the front. But it was just the technique that was done, and it makes sense that way. And then obviously, just to continue on that there's an option, and that's in 8.1. So there is really no requirements in 8.1. 8.1 says the option, if you already are following 9001, or they don't use the word certified because there's different terminology depending on how your lab was accredited or certified, that you would also meet the intent, or you would follow the sections of 8.2 to 8.9 would meet the requirements of 17025. Now, when obviously you get audited by an accreditation body, they'll touch on parts of that because they will have no choice. They will still want to see your performance of management reviews specific to the lab and things of that nature. But as far as the techniques you use, the processes you use would be the same. Now, just to,
hey Dave.
Sure.
Just a comment here, especially if the lab is inside another QMS, quality management system, whichever flavor, aerospace to automotive to you name it, ISO 9001, there's an opportunity now that the lab can use, because of what the ISO 17025 has done, makes it plain and clear. You can use all the processes from your ISO 9001 without duplicating any effort inside just the lab.
Absolutely.
That's the option B, yeah.
Absolutely. And for myself, having done this so many different times and so many, it's a breath of fresh air. It's really good. And it's nice that everybody's in alignment. So, you know, many other industries have taken the lead. So it's going to be, I think it's going to change things a lot. And then a couple just general things, as I said before, impartiality. You'll notice in other standards, they actually have a lot to do with that as well, as far as professional conduct and code of conduct. So labs, as Chad just said, well, it's great to have your lab when you're inside a manufacturing facility, but you don't want to be pressured by production or pressured by some program manager that, you know, to skip a test or to, you know, not do the test report correctly or to compromise the results because you are part of a larger organization. So that's the opposite side of it, obviously. And that will, you know, it has the brakes on to be very careful about that right in the beginning of the standard. Don't go there. You know, so, and that's, so we have different communication methods to make sure there's no undue pressure from other parts of the organization. And then a little bit more, it doesn't matter. I said for the first, it was really amazing. I helped, the first lab I ever helped had 3 people. So it still works wonderfully regardless of the size of the organization. Labs have a tendency to be smaller, but you could also do it in one lab and carry it out globally through many labs in the system. So the other thing they added in is the reason why 17025 is there is to help accreditation bodies, to help, you know, organizations, to help consulting companies. Also, it also gives us consistency for peer assessments if we want to do that. So we could, you know, help, maybe we could even calibrate ourselves by doing audits of each other's labs. So if we're kind of all following the same standard, it kind of gives us that possibility as well, which is really, really good. Just to give you a little bit more, this was already mentioned, but the definition, I'm not going to do definitions too much, just to show you a couple things, that sampling is now part, whenever with the word used for laboratory activities, it implies sampling. If sampling activities are done in part, prior or in the testing, that ultimately, though, it's going to become subsequent test and or calibration results. Sampling on its own generally does not provide the ultimate end customer the result, but it depends on what's done. It might if it does some types of checks. So it depends on the activity. So it's given that flexibility for that. Just a couple things. There's a lot of definitions in the front of the standard. I just added just to show you a couple here. Impartiality. The other thing that's was joking when I did a class a couple of weeks ago about the difference between interlaboratory comparisons and intralaboratory comparisons, if you can even pronounce it, is, you know, they're encouraging now for you to do additional sampling, or we call it maybe master checking or reagent duplication, or type of, we call it a controlled negative or controlled positive during the test or calibration, that would also help us understand our variability or uncertainty, or the effectiveness of that test. And it's been encouraged to do that rather than just relying on proficiency testing or calibration or those type of things. So we want to take on a bigger role within our lab to do additional validation or verification, hence why I have the words there. So verification is completing the test. Validation would be, you know, is it adequate for the intended use that the end user would take the report or the information for. You know, that's why I'm very adamant about calibration labs. They issue a certificate, yet that doesn't have the uncertainty or maybe the before and after results. And I'm still seeing that today, and I can't understand why that's being done incorrectly. So this, without that data, it doesn't help me with my future validation of the test I may be using that piece of equipment for. So we're trying to expand on that understanding of verification and validation. So now, just to continue, I would like to give you just a little bit more understanding of how ISO fits into this. I was searching, and I usually create cross-reference tables just for my own brain and how it works, and I highlight my standards and I tediously go through it. And I do that either way. But I never really had some good comparison tables. I have created some. I'm going to show you little snippets of some that are in here. Comparing maybe the new ISO 9000 to the 17025, or comparing it to the old standard. So the high level structure, now the sections from 4 to 10 in the new ISO 9000 has been aligned, but it hasn't been fully aligned. And I'll show you that, which is kind of unfortunate, but maybe it's just not quite necessary in a lab. You know, at least they tied it together. So as I said before, if you have accreditation to 72, if you want to get accredited to 17025, now you have the option of ISO, because if you have that, you'll have ISO. But if you already have ISO 9000, or you're following that, then it would be sort of equal to one another. Not exactly, it depends. You have to be careful how the scope is, and you're going to work with your accreditation body, the scope of registration, I mean, not necessarily the tests that you do, but just which lab it is, what am I doing, what activities overall. So how do I relate within to my internal company? We're going to have to explain that properly. And that will be something we'll have to do over the next 1 to 3 years, as far as the people that are, on the call today, as far as transition periods go. So we'll take our time making sure this all works out right. And as Chad showed earlier, the history of Guide 25 hence became 17025. And then you look at, they tried to, in the edition when it was 2005, they tried to kind of use a bit of the ISO, but it was very cut and paste. And it was, as I've seen so many different standards, it was very hard to follow. This whole thing with having manuals and complex manuals, it's all gone now. When I do quality manuals, and Omnix and we do them, we just do PowerPoint presentations, and that still works wonderfully today, explaining the system. But now they're very well aligned where we are now. You notice there's about almost 2 years difference, though, in the two standards between ISO 9001 and 17025. You may have already switched over part of your business or your company to the new ISO 9000 2015. They've merged the technical, so the technical requirements, there's no longer a separate technical requirements anymore. I'll explain that in a few minutes. There's operations and there's processes, just like there would be in any other business. So we focus on technical parts within the standard, but it doesn't have section 4 for quality and section 5 for technical. It no longer does that. There are a few people still holding on to that concept, but it will be long gone within 3 years from now. So this shows kind of an illustration of, or a exact illustration by that means, for 9000. It shows that it's generally a consistent plan, do, check, act cycle, as it always has been, or at least for the past 20 some odd years, and that we plan a system, we implement it, we improve it, we evaluate its performance. And in the center of that is our leadership or our management. The 17025 didn't go as far as saying leadership. They talk about management, but they didn't go quite as far as leadership. Really because it's focused on technical activities, but this leadership part of it is still exceptionally important. So we'll show you that relationship in a couple seconds. So I put a side-by-side little illustration. This has helped kind of we used to call it, when I was becoming a quality engineer, we call it like a kind of a pocket reminder of what we had, or a little sheet I would stick it in. So these are a little reminder to myself, I have my scope and my normative reference and my definitions, just like any standard. But when we get into section 4, we now have general requirements, and then we have structural requirements, resources, processes, and management systems. Where in the previous ISO 9000, what it does is it has context. We didn't take the term context directly necessarily, because the context in a lab is your scope, hence your range, and or your customers. But there still is focus on customer. But in leadership, instead, we have the structural, we have planning and support. What I did on the next page is I kind of showed where the new 17025 compares to I'll call it the new ISO 9000. It's not that new anymore, but it shows how it ties together, aside from the 3 introductory sections. So the general requirements and structural requirements in ISO 9001 is the context and leadership. Then when we get into resources, that's the same thing as support, and mainly support. So they call it resources instead in 17025, but it's called support in ISO. But it also has a bit to do with the resources part of 17025 also has a bit to do with the external providers or the suppliers. They put it in the front end of the resource section, because a supplier doesn't necessarily impact directly when you're doing the test. It has commodities and cables, wires, whatever, but I do not need parts necessarily from a supplier to execute the test continuously. As would in manufacturing company, because the raw materials are coming in. So that was why. Then in the process requirements, which is the same thing as operations, it would have been nice if they'd used the word operations, but the compromise was using the word the process and the process approach, so we call it the process requirements. So that would apply to, I'll show you in a few minutes, anything from taking in a request for a test or calibration and the samples coming in the door to, shipping the sample back and or test report back. So that's those operations. And then, as I mentioned, we have the management system requirements in the back end. So this is planning for the overall lab and the support, the performance and improvement. And it will have the internal auditing and all that side of things in the subpart of performance. So this is a really simple illustration, but this covers about almost 80% of the tying back and forth. The one thing I did too for kind of the people, and this is to help myself to kind of remember the two standards, I also did a little simple comparison of the 17025 current, the new one, to the old one, if you will. So there's no longer, you'll see in the resource side of it, you have all that stuff to do with developing a test method, doing the calibration or doing the initial traceability and some of the uncertainty. That's all now in initial planning or the resources of prior to going to offering the test. You would do all that front end work first, which is kind of like design, if you will. You're kind of designing a new test method, if you want to think, or a new calibration method, and what kind of is involved in doing that. Then when we get into the section 7, that's taking the test request or calibration request, and then you say, do I currently have this test method? If not, I have to develop and go back to the resource side of it, and then carrying out the test and reporting it and following it all the way through to shipping it. And then at the end of that, if I did have a non-conformance, would I correct the test result, or how would I do that? And then in the management side, we also, you notice there, I put the risk part down at the bottom there. It replaced 412 of this current standard, which was to do with kind of improvement in other areas there too. So it replaced that part, and it's no longer there. So in the front end now, this is, establishing your systems and your processes, your document and records management or information management. And it also has corrective action and all the stuff to do with management review. So that's for people that are used to the old standard, a simple illustration. The fundamentals, though, of any quality system from the essence of ISO 9000 was to make sure we have the needs and expectations of the customer, quality objectives and processes, and the interaction of those processes. The one thing, the problem with procedures is you don't show how things interact with each other. And that's one of the most important parts. And then we can measure the effectiveness and efficiency of processes, and then prevent things from going wrong. So we put tools in place within individual processes to prevent things from going wrong. And ultimately, as that cycle showed, we want to do continual improvement. And they even use the word continual now. From ISO 9000, we still like to understand the principles of ISO 9000 and make sure that we understand those same principles could be used in 17025. Focus on the customer leadership and engaging people, and then the process of how processes and activities tie together within our lab, and that we improve our lab or improve the customer relationships, and we use the information available to us as far as uncertainty or test results. And we also can build relationships with the customer as far as making sure they're happy with the validation of the results, and that we're clear on what requirements they want up front, and that they get a good test report or calibration certificate at the end. Okay, just a little bit more on the process approach and a bit of risk. Now, keeping in mind, this is a very simple snapshot. All courses that we offer or services go into much greater detail. We've done so much wonderful work in risk management in the last several years, long before the standards were changed. We very knew all this was coming, and FMEAs and all that stuff, failure modes and effects analysis. So just to give a kind of just a summary of the process approach, sequence interaction of the processes and activities and how they fit together. Could even be remote sites. When we say that, it could be the remote activities of someone sampling, how does that interact? Or when we do on-site calibration or test services, which are really important, and how all those things interact with each other. And not just, and maybe from an efficiency standpoint too, not just effectiveness, but are we giving people value? And excuse me, and then the definition of a process, how we map that out, how we define it. It didn't take it as far as having process owners, but it does talk about responsibility for laboratory activities. And then we should look at our business risk perhaps, but in the risks really of achieving the intended results is ISO, but we also have the risk of not giving the lab activities or compromising the lab activities, which would ultimately compromise the test or the calibration result. We could lose data. We could have compromised data. We have a lot of problem with PDFs and viewing things on PDF right now. And it's just kind of, the technology is kind of causing some problems there. Or whether you use videos or don't use videos or pictures, can we see them or not see them, size of files, all those type of things are causing difficulties right now. And then how we monitor each of those processes to satisfy the end result of our customer or test result. This is a visual from ISO 9000. You guys may have seen this before, but it shows what we mean from what a process is defined, inputs, outputs, sequence, interaction. But it also expands sometimes in ISO. They want you to look at responsibilities and authority, how we evaluate those processes, but you may consider the risk and opportunities also within the individual processes. It didn't go as far as to say you had to do it in each process within the lab, but you have to do risk and opportunity or risk identification within the lab. This I introduced a long time ago. This was I think I did this maybe 10 years ago for a lab. It may have been longer. I've been trying to always encourage labs to do a process approach. So this shows kind of a map. And what it shows, just to give you a little kind of simple illustration, is it shows that there's processes that are management related. That would be kind of in the section of 8 of the standard, if you wanted the new section 8 maybe, where we have strategic planning, management review, and corrective action, and training and all that, document control, kind of a bit old style. And then these are core labs or core activities in the middle here, where we might have some technical sales sometimes if we're a commercial type lab, and then developing a new test method and validating that new test method. Those could be separate processes or activities because there's sometimes a gap in between there. And then how we carry out the tests or calibration, how we report it, how we ship or destroy the samples, if that may be part of the case. And then some of the support activities that might have impact on what we do. So the facilities and how clean the facilities are. We would have purchasing perhaps, calibration of our own equipment, not the calibration services. And then the lab QA, we call it lab QA or QC, and laboratory comparisons. So that's always been there where, and I've been very happy that it's been done that way. And ironically enough, 10 years ago, so now the new standard of 17025 has taken it to that level and said, here's how you might see a common process approach at a lab level showing the standards. So the one thing I've told all this time I've been doing quality systems, environmental systems, you have 2 paths. We have the path of the part coming in or the sample coming in, and then we have the path of the information. Okay, so there's 2 different paths. That's kind of what this is showing as well. So we have paths of information, and those would be the results and all the data and all the manipulation of the data, and that's the sample being returned or sent back. So it's kind of did sampling, preparation, calibration, and then you send the sample back perhaps. And then here's where we do the test request, the validation of the result, the uncertainty, but then carrying out. This obviously is that whole center section I showed you before in the previous slide. And then we'll have some management activities in the middle that we may have to manage from time to time. The resources and the planning and how we're going to do certain tests in a lab, which can be very difficult in a lab when people take holidays. obviously, because a lot of labs have
Hey, Dave.
limited resources. Sure.
You know, this is great. I mean, as you said, you know, showing how to do a process approach that we've been doing for a long time, and seeing something like this in the standard itself is a great thing. But a word of caution for those of you, listening in, is that it would be a shame if everybody's process map looks like this, because and so you would become more clause oriented, we would say. So be careful that you just don't just follow this exactly the way it is. Look at your process and what your process should be, as Dave shows in the previous slide. Thank you, Dave.
Right. Absolutely. And to use your own terminology, if you call it test request or calibration request or sample preparation, use your own terms. Don't go with the standard. Don't fall into that trap. Okay, good point, Chad. Okay, just a couple other things. So people go, oh, well, where in the standards does it talk about all this process approach? Well, it comes up in section 824 of the management system section, talks about using the process approach, using processes in 17025. And then also in management review, this is really important and very subtle change, but it's really important. The outputs of the management review shall record all the decisions and actions related to at least the effectiveness of the management systems and its processes. Really, really important. And I also made a connection too in the control of data and information. They talk about it in there that you have processes in there, hence processes and document information, kind of synonymous of one another, if you will. And also they used a really detailed example in complaints and how you have to have a really good process and all examples of the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle within the complaints process, taking the complaint, carrying it through, making sure the person's satisfied, and then maybe the next time you run a test or calibration, verifying that they're happy the next time. I'm oversimplifying.
Hey, Dave.
Sure.
One more point we can make is if you go to ISO 9000, the definition of a procedure is a specified way to carry out an activity or a process. So if you look at it that way, the standard is filled with the word process, but they're just calling it a procedure. If that makes any sense.
Right. Well, there's the problem is labs were used to having purpose, definition, the steps of a process, and even because of our ASTM standards, ISO standards, and we still have to sort of think that way, but we're not adding as much value that way. So we'll take it to.
Hey, Dave, it appears we're running over.
Yeah.
So
no, we have.
folks,
I'm looking. We are at 53 minutes right now. Keeping track of it. We're almost done.
Yeah.
So I'll let you then. And we'll just. This is just going to summarize. So as risk management. So the standard does require it. We have to consider risk and opportunities within the lab. So we have to plan those risk and opportunities, and we will plan that out and make sure that we execute. Now, this is a very big change. The risk of giving out the wrong information, getting the wrong information at the beginning. How would we compromise our test results or calibration results? We can do different various techniques. They do not specify one technique over another, but if you define a risk or an opportunity, maybe to use new software in your opportunities, but that could create a risk and vice versa, that we kind of look at that and carry it through under the actions that we're going to do to address risk. For people new to ISO 9000, you would have went through that already, or other industries, aerospace and medical devices has already had risk management. Okay, just to show, but what we ultimately try to do too is take our processes from that map and look at a key indicator, which we call a KPI, or key indicator in this area here. And we try to think, okay, which processes would that be? And then we're not going to have complex processes, but we want to think of the risk within those processes too, so that, and be confident that they're being carried out from a preventive-based way of thinking. And then ultimately that will help with our continual improvement within our lab. So if we make a mistake and we send it out to a customer, something's wrong, we're going to go back and say, hey, how come I didn't understand that could have happened? I didn't see that mistake. And then we'll update our risk management, hence our processes. Okay. The one thing I did too, for anybody taking any courses in the future, I go through the new standard, and what I do is I go through it and I explain to people, and we talk about the differences. Or here's an example of impartiality in all the new sections. So they even use the word risk in impartiality, which is very unique if you see down there in 414. Okay, so the word risk comes up 4 or 5 times just in that section alone. And the other example I put in here is to do with ensuring the validation of test results. You see all the new stuff in there. Alternative test and calibration, other functional checks. We could use working standards or control charts, statistics to monitor stability of our tests, or even how often you've carried out a test. And then we could review the results, and then we could also do blind sampling. So those are some of the, minute changes, if you will. So I go through that with people. And then the last thing, just before we go, just to talk a little bit about, and this will be fairly new, or like it's so new to us, but how much time do we really have as far as the implementation goes? Now, it's very interesting, and some of you may know this, and some of you may not, that labs also sometimes their surveillance audits aren't done annually. They're sometimes done every 2 years. So that can have an impact on how this works. And when your accreditation's up, whether it's a 2, 3, 4 year cycle. So, but we came out in November last year. So we have 3 years from the date. It's specified in there and in any of the documents you'll read. So we have 3 years to transition over. So for November 2010. Now you wouldn't want to do that because you're going to give yourself some time to write up nonconformances, 90 days, 120 days you'd want to have. And it also depends on where you are with ISO 9000. Do you have a customer demand with this new requirement or new standard? Do you want to add in additional testing or sampling to your scope or your range, if you will? When's a good time to do that as far as cost-wise? And what is the policy of maybe your accreditation body? When do they want you to switch over? And we kind of work that out. We have some time to do that. But every time you wait too long, I'm dealing with all of that right now. And Omnex, we're going crazy with all these last minute changes to the standard and the deadline of September for everybody. And a lot of people aren't going to make it. So try not to wait too long. Okay, and then a bit of transition. What we try to do is just make sure you have a leadership team, the lab teams involved. You could do a gap analysis. I've already done some gap analysis for labs. We did one with some practice with some people we had in our Ann Arbor office a few weeks back. And then what you want to do, create a transition plan that you step through how you're going to do it, create a team, small team, do a gap analysis, create an implementation plan, have a strategy involved, document the process, and roll it out. We also would be required to conduct new internal audits of all the changes you've made or improvements you may have made, and then do management review. And in parallel, you're going to be working with the third-party accreditation bodies to make sure you get re-accredited. This is what we've added into some of our other documents that we do. We talk about, we call them strategies, different strategies. I gave some examples of 3 strategies here that we use. We look at the high-level structure and how that fits into what I currently may have for ISO. And then we also look at interested parties. That's more from a ISO standpoint, 9001, but we can look at that. Then we have to develop some risk methodologies. Then we have to expand maybe the leadership role if that's necessary, depending on it. We're going to look at our code of conduct, and then we're going to look at how we tie our processes together and how we maybe might use some software to manage some of these different documents, or different information is the better term. And then do we want to, kind of do quality, environmental, and health and safety all together? It's a great time to think about it. You have all the time now. Okay. And we'll create a Gantt chart or a timeline for how we do that. Okay. Chad, do you want to go with the additional last bit here just to wrap things up? Would that be good?
Go ahead, Dave. And while you
look at the questions, and we'll answer some questions. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So we have some different books on integration. We have different books on how to do ISO auditing. We're doing
all from ASQ, Dave. People can contact either Omnex or they can contact ASQ to get these books.
Okay. Okay. Good. So lots of different resources available to you.
And I think you may have 1 or 2 slides. There have been questions. In fact, as you do the next slide, it might just go in. We have a question: what auditing training do we see that will be needed new? So let me answer, and then you can answer if you have a different answer, Dave.
Absolutely.
I would say, labs that are currently 17025 need to get your internal auditors trained. And there's 2 options. You can either get them trained as an internal auditor or lead auditor. And we also have understanding training. You can take the understanding training, which is the first 2 days of the lab course. Dave, anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I've developed all the courses. They're in great shape. We're all fine-tuning them. You know, the lead auditor course will be also available in the future soon too. So we're just finishing that up right now. If you choose to go that route, more of an international accreditation, but that as well, absolutely. There's on-site services for gap analysis and, you know, any assistance that you need there. We have different courses in risk management, and we have risk tools that we use, and integration of quality, health, safety, different courses. So they're all listed there for you. Schedules are on the internet, whether you do it Canada, US, worldwide, countries, offices all over the world.
Dave, let me continue on. There's we have about 30 or so questions.
Yeah.
And we're not going to get to all of them, but let's do, the next one is application now for labs doing testing for autonomous vehicles.
Right.
Let me just make a comment on autonomous vehicles, especially when you talk about autonomous vehicles. ISO 26262 comes into play, and there are a number of tests that need to be done, and so definitely you need to really think about what kind of a lab management system you need, you know, because the safety requirements are that much.
Safety labs, Chad, if you know, a lot of the safety labs, even within tier ones, have already been accredited for 17025 because of safety testing on behalf of the OEMs. So it's already been done.
Great.
It will go, definitely they will go to 17025. I can't see how they wouldn't have to. So.
Next question, what form is the risk-based thinking to be demonstrated in a laboratory? You want to take that one on, Dave?
Sure. There's done different ways it's done. We usually rate the risk level, whether high, medium, low, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, and the impact that would have on the end result. And we might look at likelihood of occurrence and ability to prevent or detect it. So there's different techniques. We usually could use an FMEA or a shrunk down failure modes and effects analysis, or various levels of cause and effect relationship. So we have different.
Dave, I'm also going to mention that the Omnex business operating system risk methodology, you know, will work fine for them. Absolutely. Along with all the other techniques that
Absolutely.
you talked about.
Absolutely.
And we have, I think, a 2-day class on that.
Yeah, and we've done lots of it recently, obviously. Yep. Okay, what else?
Talk about, will the ISO 17025 checklist for lab accreditation change? Absolutely, you know, because the customer says, I'm using the previous 17025 version. The lab checklist will change. And Absolutely. If you're getting ready for your accreditation right now, or let's say certification right now, maybe you don't change. But if you have just started, we would recommend looking at this new standard, which will become mandatory after the 3-year period, transition period. Next, Dave, could you talk a little bit about the pass-fail reporting in a lab report? Is it optional?
No, they actually improved that. No, if the test you are doing, it's an excellent question. If the test you are doing requires pass-fail, and that's part of the test, you have to specifically stipulate whether it passed or failed. There's actually, it's been added to the new standard to clarify it. If it is a pass-fail type test, you absolutely have to say that it fails.
In fact, it's a non-conformance I give when I do design, and I look at the design like a DVPNR. I'm just saying, not only in the lab report. In lab report, it's super important.
For qualification testing, same thing. You don't want to be in between when it comes to that. Now, it's not the lab's fault that it failed or anything of that nature. I went and saw a lab recently, and they said they called it non-conformances because they failed a test. It's not a lab non-conformance because you failed a test.
I'm going to continue, Dave. Sure. Will A2LA be going to be used this new standard? Absolutely. There's a transition period. Yeah, every A2LA when they do this is acting as a registrar. They will have to use this lab.
Yeah, I have signed letters already. The signed letter agreements are already in place. Yep.
Great. We're thinking of getting our 17025 lab certified. Is there an intro webinar on what we must do to prepare? I'll say this could be our intro webinar, but we also have, we can do a specialized course just for you. which we do. We have something called UDI, Understanding, Documenting, Implementing. Please do inquire with an Omnex, and one of our experts like Dave would do the training for you. Next question. I think we've answered it. What are some of the significant improvements? All right, okay, this question is a little complicated. Let me read it out. I would kindly ask you what have been some of the most significant improvements in a company after ISO 9001 affected 17025. What they're saying is, if you're a lab and if you do this new standard, Dave, what kind of improvements will I see inside my company? I'm going to take it as that.
Yeah, no, I think one of the benefits, I mean, the benefits of ISO have always been to, focus on the customer primarily, right? First of all, so the customer will be more satisfied. And then also, by the kind of putting your processes and risk management together, you're going to reduce your cost and you're going to improve your efficiency and effectiveness. And efficiency and effectiveness should be thought of as a lab. You want to use your resources properly and get the best value out of those from a cost standpoint. And the end result, good test results, and be able to manage change as you move forward. That would sum it up.
So we'll do 3 more questions, and here's the first one of the 3. Will regional authorities have guidelines specific, or will 17025 get rolled out uniformly? I'll answer to that if you want, unless you want to. What have we seen with the last 17025, Dave? Have you seen the different countries?
Regional authorities is a pretty broad question. I don't know if regional is the right. Regional within countries, absolutely. Countries have signed agreements, if you want to think of regions that way, that 17025 will be used unilaterally globally, like South America to North America to Asia. That's already in place. And what governing bodies oversee that. That's done. Now, whether an industry or whether a company chooses to use 17025 is up to the individual industry, which they do. For example, it has been done in installation of medical equipment in hospitals and things of that, and they put it in their contract thus, and they will follow 17025 as it is laid out. And the people who accredit you will have the expertise in that area as far as technical competency. So it will be in place.
Question
but the industries decide in some cases.
Can you please repeat when ISO IEC 17025 2005 will be obsoleted?
Sure.
It's
3 years from November. Yep.
3 years starting September 2017. November 2017.
November 2017. So November 2020. Okay.
Thank you. I'll take this last question. Will the change to an internal lab, a calibration lab, what will be the change to internal calibration lab for IATF? Folks, this does not affect your IATF 16949 requirements. Continue with that. All I mentioned is because of some of these changes in 17025, eventually it'll have a ripple effect on IATF 16949.
Yeah, it will only be
as we stand today, no change. Go ahead, Dave.
For an internal lab, but if you're using external lab, because any internal lab is going to use an external lab to do calibration, or else you're not traceable, which obviously you would have to do calibration or bring people in, then you will have to gradually transition to the new standard.
And Dave, when, as you know, for about 12 years or so, we had a registrar, and our registrar did many 17020. First, we started out in the the 25, and then we did a number of 17025 certifications in manufacturing plants. So if you did do that, which many of you have, of course, you'll have to, update your 17025 implementation. If you don't have a 17025 implementation and you're just following the IATF 16949 requirements, as of now, there's no change.
Yeah,
Dave,
what we all want to do, though, just to help everybody, within about a year and a half period from now, you got to start asking your suppliers that provide calibration or test services as to when their transition period is. So you're
Absolutely.
not
That's our due diligence
you're not left hanging
as companies using labs, right?
Everybody uses a lab. Everybody does, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, okay, that was excellent. Thank you.
Dave, thank you very much. Folks, on behalf of Omnex, Mr. Dave Barber and myself, Chad Kymal, we're signing off. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And as you know, we have webinars time to time, and look forward to having you in a future webinar or a training class for Omnex. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.